Welcome to Leaders and Legends, the podcast focused on leadership and clinical trial execution. I'm your host, Patty Lushton, CEO of Diligent Pharma. In each episode, we'll get to know the individuals who are driving change and influencing the direction of our industry. Whether you're a seasoned executive yourself, an emerging leader, or simply passionate about clinical trials like I am, join us as we discuss our industry's most pressing challenges, the future of clinical trials, and hear insights and advice from the leaders who are moving our industry forward. Steve, so good to see you. Thank you so much for being part of this podcast.
Thanks, Patty. Looking forward to it.
So, this is a podcast about leadership in clinical trials, and you have obviously have had an illustrious career, and I kind of want to explore your leadership journey. And I guess my first question is, how and why did you get into clinical trials?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, isn't it? Your life takes, interesting paths based on sometimes random sort of events, I suppose. I did a science degree in Sydney at the University of Sydney, and I was sort of wondering what I should do once I finished that. I was wondering what I should do, and I was wandering around the university one day and ran into somebody who was doing a PhD down at the veterinary school. So I thought, oh, that sounds like a bit of fun. They've got a scholarship going down there. So I wandered down, and I managed to be able to get that. And so I did a PhD sort of somewhat unexpectedly. I never really planned that. And my supervisor at the time, his wife was working in the pharmaceutical industry, and she was working for it was Park Davis at the time. So you can tell how long ago it was. And she said there's a project manager job going at Sandoz, when Sandoz was the R&D based sort of pharmaceutical company as opposed to the sort of generics company it is now. And so I went down there. The head of the medical department, went to the same school as I did, so there was a little bit of a connection there, and I got into pharmaceutical development. I always enjoyed the science part of it. My strength was science, and I liked the data and the numbers, but there was also that health, that medical aspect. My father was a surgeon in Sydney, so we had some connection with the medical community, and so it was sort of a natural sort of evolution to get into sort of science and science around the business side of things. I really enjoyed the business side of things. So the combination of science and business, pharmaceuticals. I spent the first 8 or 9 years of my career at a pharmaceutical company, which I think has helped me for my career within the CRO space. But that's really how I got into it. As I say, a series of random accidents sort of basically. Yeah. But I guess there was some sort of method in the madness in terms of, what my interests were and what my strengths were, really.
Yeah, I was talking to Jennifer Byrne from Javara, and she said sort of the same thing, that just sort of by happenstance, sort of finding herself into this industry. And then, of course, fast forward 30, 35 years, the same with me, just being studying molecular biology, not liking sort of my life in the lab and wanting to try something, just a little bit different. And I was trying to remember, Steve, when we first met, if it was at Kendall or at Quintiles, it was, early days, like, the early 2000s or so. And so you sort of made this transition from Sandoz pharma industry into the CRO world. And it was a very different time back then, right? So, I will go back a little bit farther in your past, but while we're on this topic, I'm just curious to get your perspective on how you think the whole CRO industry has changed and evolved from the time that you first sort of entered into it. Probably at Quintiles, is that right? I'm trying to remember the progression. Quintiles, then Kendall.
Quintiles, then Kendall, and then Icon for the last 13 years. Yeah, I got into the CRO industry in the mid-90s. So that's how old I am, I suppose. So I'd moved around a little bit. I spent obviously the first few years of my career in Australia, and then I got transferred to the UK. And interestingly, Sandoz at that time was setting up their sort of CRO within their development centre in the UK. That low cost country, the United Kingdom. It sounds very very funny now. But it's interesting the way things develop. Excuse me, um, because once I realized fairly soon in the pharma industry that without a medical degree, I had a PhD but not a medical degree, I wasn't going to, sort of go to the top of the organization. Whereas the CRO industry offered, I think, people with PhDs or people who could get things done, a more positive career path,
Yeah,
really, quite frankly. So it
right.
wasn't a hard decision to move to Q. I moved to Q, went back to Australia, I then went to South Africa. I came back to the UK. So I've moved around a lot. I think I've worked on 4 different continents over my career, not just
Wow.
one country. So it's been quite an interesting sort of progression, I guess, as I've moved forward.
Yeah, and at the time, was it Dennis Gillings was the CEO of
Right.
Quintiles?
That's right. Yeah, Dennis. The Quintal has been established, in the early '80s, I suppose, originally, in North Carolina, in a caravan, basically in the car park in the University of North Carolina. Dennis had all those stories, and I met him early on, and he was a tremendous mentor and a tremendous, leader in the industry, one of the founders of the industry, and he's still involved. So it's been interesting as a sort of second generation, I suppose, CEO in the CROs taking over from the founders, the Joe von Rickenbachs and the Candace Kendall,
Yes.
the Fred Eshelmans and the Dennis Gillings. And so our industry's really developed, I think, very substantially over the last 20 years. I'd say a much more reliable industry now. Initially, as you probably recognise, we were an extra pair of hands, an extra, more bodies to do things. Right?
Right.
And when I was at Sandoz, I would also that would also be the way I would approach it as well. So it's interesting the way things develop, and I think we're a much more reliable, better, more consistent industry now,
Yeah.
not individual companies, but industry now. And I think we're a really good resource for the pharmaceutical industry now. And I think that's one of the big changes that's happened over the last 20 years. We do things very well, I think. I think many pharma managers recognize the expertise that now lies within the CRO industry. We compete toe to toe. In fact, I always say to my guys, we need to be 20% better than pharma. If we're not 20% better, then they will. It's an equivocal and a tough decision for them to whether to outsource or not.
Yeah. And there's an opportunity to be better because you have such a breadth and scope of the, different indications that, you're involved in and the different geographical locations. So the sheer level of experience and the things that a large organization like Icon touches, I would imagine provides incredible value. And I agree. I mean, I started working with Hein Besselar back in the sort of late 80s, early 90s. And so there was that whole sort of earlier regime of, CRO leaders that were paving the way. And, I'm just, the industry itself has changed so much as you stated. And I'm just curious your perception of Icon. And, I mean, Icon is one of the most influential companies in the industry and has the potential to drive change. And I'm wondering if, you can describe just one or two of the challenges that you feel that Icon is addressing to sort of move the industry forward.
Yeah, I mean, there's plenty of challenges, Patty, as you well know. We're doing clinical trials is a tough job. We're dealing with people. We're dealing with physicians and investigators whose main job is usually not running clinical trials. It's treating
Right.
patients. It's curing their patients of disease and helping them to remain healthy. So it's a sort of sidebar for them, and we have to manage through that. And of course, we in the CRO industry we have very significant expectations from customers to do things and do things well and do them in a reliable and a consistent manner. So it's not for the faint-hearted, our industry. You have to have a
Yes.
fairly thick skin. You have to be assertive, but you also have to recognize that you're running a service organization. So, in terms of the challenges that we see, it's not rocket science. It's around getting sites to a point where they can recruit patients, supporting those sites in a way that allows them to do the right thing with recruiting those patients, collecting that data, making their life easier rather than harder. And I don't, we don't always do that terribly well as an industry. We make the sites have a tough time, but we're trying to facilitate the clinical trial within the site, to get the sites up and running and ready to recruit patients, with the technology and with the processes that allows them to do it more easily. You've all heard the figures about sites that investigators who run one clinical trial and never touch another one
Exactly.
because the administrative burden is so great. So that's one area. The other area for us is patient recruitment. It's always been an area that I'm been very passionate about, and we build a site network, and we continue to try to build a site network that allows us to bring patients into clinical trials more effectively. I believe the figures are still only around 3 to 5% of people have been involved in a clinical trial. I think that's way too low. I'd love to finish my career, with that number being closer to 20% or 25%. That might be a stretch, but it's the sort of number that I think if we really want to, reduce the cost of clinical trials, we have to make, clinical research. I think Jennifer talks about it. Jennifer Byrne talks about it. Clinical research is a care option. It needs to be an option for every time you go to your doctor. They need to have, a clinical trial available to you to participate in. We all know
Yeah.
patients do better in clinical trials than they do, in normal course of clinical care. So it's helping to make recruitment a sort of normal part of clinical life, and getting patients into trials in 3 months instead of 3 years. That really starts to change the game, and that's where we're trying to go as an organisation. And it is around, I think, integrating more vertically integrating our business, so we are closer to sites. We're making it easier for sites to participate and to do the right thing by all of their patients, not just the ones that they enter into trials. It's the ones that they treat on a clinical basis as well.
I really like that because I think, there's people who think that there's some sort of silver bullet out there with technology or AI, but it really is getting down to the basics of getting patients in trials. And in some ways, it's kind of a paradox because I know, at Avoca, this was years ago, but we did research and that showed that patients actually want to participate in clinical trials, but there is this sort of divide in a way, whether it be lack of access or, communication. And you would think that by now that 3 to 5% would already be at the 15 to 20% because of the, technological innovation and DCTs and just all of the efforts around that. So, I mean, what is holding us back? Like, do you have a kind of a sense for that?
I think there's a million things, and no one thing is sort of overwhelming. But I'll give you an example. I mean, the privacy, I'm I'll maybe a little controversial here, but some of the privacy regulation, particularly in Europe, GDPR, I think is holding us back. I have a fundamental belief that
Yeah.
most people are altruistic and are quite happy to have their data on a de-identified basis be available for clinical research, and to be contacted, to be involved at their choice, of course, to be involved in a clinical trial. I think GDPR makes that very difficult, certainly in Europe, and I'm really hoping that the United States doesn't go down the same sort of track, because I think it's going to make it even more difficult, sort of on a global basis. So I think there are things like that. I mean, we are highly regulated, and there's
Yeah.
good reasons for us to be highly regulated. We need to, but 35-page patient-informed consent forms, I don't think help us very much. And quite frankly, I don't think they help the patient very much. So I think there's a tendency to sort of go overboard with some of the documentation, some of the regulation. And, I think if we could sort of simplify, we need clear principles of ethics and integrity and honesty and transparency. But I think we sometimes go a bit over the top with some of the
Yeah.
data requirements, some of the regulations that we impose on ourselves, or that the government imposes on us. And I think there's a lot of things that we could do to make it more simple, to make it easier for sites, to make it easier for patients, to make it easier for pharma companies and CROs to recruit patients.
Yeah. Yes, I agree. I wonder if, as you were talking, I wonder if the relationships with international, regulatory authorities, there's something there that needs to shift because I often feel that pharma companies have sometimes an overinterpretation of the regs. So it's almost like a fear base,
Yeah,
going to the
yeah,
nth degree.
yeah,
And in doing so,
yeah,
patients, as you described, are having to deal with this sort of bureaucratic quagmire that we're all in. And, I think, easier said than done because I'm in some ways on the sidelines, looking in, trying to drive change, but not in the thick of it. But some of the things you described should be more straightforward than they are right now to change and address, like informed consent. And so do you think that the connections, the collaborations with regulators could make a difference in that?
yes, I do. I think I look at the work that organisations like ACRO are doing in linking up with EMA and FDA, and I
Hmm.
think there's good work there. I think increasingly our association is having an influence on regulators. I was at the ACRO annual general meeting the other day, and I heard a number of examples of where an ACRO submission had significantly changed, some rule that was being brought in, and I think that's exactly what we should be
Yeah.
doing. So I'm really encouraged by those sorts of organisations and what we're doing in that sort of space. But it's a challenge. It's a problem. There's always a tendency, as you say, to be to go to the most conservative approach. When we go to customers sometimes and say, "Hey, there's a different way of doing this. We can do a much lower, percentage of source data verification. Or we can do an adaptive trial here." And the question is always, how many drugs have you got to market, using that approach? And we go, well, not very many or none, or and they go, well,
Yes.
let's just do it the same way we've always done it. And I understand it. I understand it. But it can be frustrating at times.
We just had our 2-day leadership team meeting and at Diligent. And I brought up this issue of doing the same thing the same way for the last, many decades
Yeah.
as one of the biggest barriers for not only our success as a company, but also any type of innovation, technological innovation. And I personally believe that that is a problem that has to be solved for in order for companies to, really do the right things for patients in terms of shortening clinical trials and driving efficiency.
I think
So
that's
there is sort of this, this inertia. Let's put it that way. Um, and you know, I I wonder, is it a matter of holding up a mirror to teams to just sort of demonstrate what's not working well and then offering a new solution, or how do you think we can break through this kind of inertia of doing the same thing the same way since the 70s and 80s?
yeah. I think there has to be, and it's probably coming. Something of a burning platform. I'll put it that way. Let's be honest. The pharmaceutical industry has been pretty well, you know, what's the word? Ring fenced in terms of patent protections and those sorts of things. But I think that there is some
Mhm.
limitation to that. I think there will be a time, and we've seen the IRA Act come in, and the drug pricing negotiations with the big selling drugs. I think that's a part of it. As that sort of stuff starts to embed, I think customers and companies are going to have no choice but to do things, to take a little bit more risk and to do things in a more unconventional way, I think, and sort of just falling back on the same old, same old. So,
Yeah.
while we all in the industry get nervous about, drug pricing controls, and that's sometimes that sort of thing will make us look at things in a different way and do things differently. And it may in fact be a catalyst towards, a different way of doing things and a more unconventional way of doing things and taking a little bit more risk in doing things. We certainly see the biotech companies who have, much more constrained capital
Right.
environment do that. They take more risk. But I think this might move, large pharma along as well. And, as I say, while we all sort of worry about that and a little bit, and drug prices are only 12% of healthcare costs, and but they get focused on, and we all sort of lament that fact. There may be some benefits in having
Yeah.
that focus, because it will mean we have to do things differently. We don't have a choice.
Yeah. It's an interesting point, and I think you're right that there is a catalyst that is needed. And I think the other follow on to that is that um, senior leaders need to engage with the teams that are on the front lines to actually communicate a need for change. I notice sort of these two parallel universes where I speak with senior executives and they are on board, driving change, driving efficiency, shortening timelines, doing whatever it takes. And you sort of talk to people who are, really struggling in terms of competing priorities and needing to get first patient in. And it's easy to fall back to the same old, same old. So I think that, change management, which is hard, especially in big companies, needs to be sort of front and center. Let's put it that way. Um, so, Steve, I want to go a little bit back in time, um, and to your early days. And no, maybe not many people know this, that you were the captain of an international rugby team that won the World Cup in Australia. And that's a pretty unique and I would say maybe intense experience to sort of be on. It's kind of being like being on the world stage and having a lot of pressure. I'm just imagining. Of course, I've not been in that position, but does that inform how you are today as a leader, or is it sort of in the rearview mirror? Like, what is it part of your life, whether consciously or unconsciously? Just that time when you were part of
Yeah.
that.
Yeah, it did. I wasn't the captain. That's just full disclosure here. I was on the team, but I played in the Australian team for about 9 or 10 years through the '80s. I suppose was my time of playing rugby. And rugby, as for some of our listeners, they may not be too familiar with rugby, but rugby's kind of, it's football without the pads and the helmets. And so it's a tough game, I suppose, in many ways. And you kind of learn how to take a knock, and you learn how to work with your team, and as with most team sports, you're only as good as your weakest link. And so it was a good education for CRO and for our industry, because I think I sometimes joke with my team and say, our industry, CRO, is a contact sport at times as well, right? Yeah. It's,
Yes.
you have to be able to take a knock, and you have to be able to, you get knocked down probably more times than you stay up, and you have to be able to get, you pick yourself up, dust yourself down, and move on. We get chosen, we don't get chosen. There are various reasons for why we get chosen, why we don't on a project or a program. And you get you. I mean, in my case, our scorecard is marked every quarter when we go to the markets as a public company. So it is I thought that my early sporting life was a good way to get to prepare for business, and particularly for the industry that we're in, that I'm in at the moment. I certainly learned a lot from playing rugby, and, as I say, relying on your teammates, working hard, being resilient, persistence, determination, all of that sort of thing comes in. It's a very important component, I would say, in my experience. Persistence and determination, and a get it done sort of attitude is probably the most important attribute you can have as a project manager or someone working within a CRO environment. Brilliance and intelligence are what was that? What's that? I think it's Ray Kroc McDonald, isn't it? Quote about the world is full of men with genius and intelligence and brilliance, but it's persistence and determination that really is the defining attributes, I think, in many walks of life, and I think it's particularly so in our industry.
Yeah. Well, to play at that level, I would imagine that you needed a lot of persistence in order to even get, to have that opportunity and hard work. So, Steve, like when you look at the future of clinical trials, say over the next 5 to 10 years, how do you expect the industry to evolve and unfold?
I think it'll be an interesting journey. I think, as I said, the days of sort of pricing, particularly in the United States, being somewhat uncontrolled, and I mean that sort of advisedly, and with IRA, and I think pricing controls are going to come in the medium term, maybe not immediately, but I do think, and so I think that is going to make us, all of us, have to be more efficient and have to challenge, as we talked about, challenge the regulations, challenge the application of new technology. We need to be a bit more like the tech companies. What Zuckerberg says, move fast and break things. Well, I don't want to break things, but we do need to move faster, and we do need to challenge ourselves. And so I think that's going to be a sort of efficiency and speed and applying appropriate technology is going to be the watchword for going forward. I can't, we can't do any interview these days, Patty, without mentioning AI and machine learning and the impact that's going to have.
Yeah.
I certainly believe that's going to have an impact on our business. It's already having an impact within Icon. But as with most things, I don't think it'll be at quite the pace that we all think it will be now, if that makes sense. You can just look back at telephony and electricity and, even motor cars. They took many years to sort of really be implemented. I think it'll be quite a long road to gain the full benefits of AI. But we do need to really welcome that, to accelerate that. I say to my team, welcome the change. Welcome the change and be part of that change. Don't resist it. Don't run away from it. Be part of it. Embrace it. I think people who embrace that change, who embed themselves in the new AI systems and the new machine will do really well, because we'll always be important. People will always be important to the drug development process. And so as you get the opportunity with new technology and new sort of AI systems, be part of it. I would say welcome it, and I think you'll do well. And I think that will really help the industry do well as well, because we do need to do things faster, better, cheaper. In my mind, we really do. It's we take too long, it's too expensive, and we need to use those catalysts of change. And I think it will be around the pricing environment that will lead to that sort of that sort of change.
Yeah, it makes sense. Yeah, it's almost the technological, capabilities are there, but there's almost like a skills gap in terms of embracing them or being aware of them. And I do think that's where the CROs and companies like ours could, provide that kind of support. And so one of my last questions, Steve, is when it's your time to sort of retire, let's say, from your job, what would you want people to remember Steve Cutler by in terms of the role you had in shaping the clinical trials industry?
Oh gosh, my legacy. Yeah, what do I want written on my tombstone? I'm not one for sort of legacies too much, Patty. I've had a great time. I've met some fantastic people, some wonderful people in this industry, people who I have enormous respect for. I was lucky enough to get to know many of the founders, the Gillings, the von Rickenbachs. I worked with Candace Kendall for a few years. John Ratliff, the current crop of CEOs, Paul Kirchgraber, David Simmons is I think that's what I've really enjoyed. They're all people who have a great outlook on life and a good way of getting things done. If you ask me to say, what I'd like to be remembered for, it's being, honest, fair. I guess I'm a bit of a hard driver. It comes, I guess, from my sporting background. I do ask a lot of my team, and they usually respond extremely well. I'd like to think that I get things done. I'm not too up on the airs and graces. I like to interact with people at all levels. I try not to ask people to do things that I wouldn't be quite happy to do myself. Those are the
Yeah.
sort of ways I sort of like to lead my organisation, and I'd like to be known for someone who got something done. I'm very proud of the acquisition of PRA Health Sciences that we made.
I
Sort of three
wanted
and
to
a half
ask
years ago.
about that. Yes.
That was
Yeah.
something that I think was a real challenge. Now it was we all were involved in it. I was the one, I guess, who signed off on it at the end, but it was something that I'm very proud of. I think we're building an organisation here at Icon that is influential, and I'd like that influence to continue long after I'm gone.
Yeah, that was huge. Well, one of the things I will always remember about you, Steve, is when I had this idea years ago to form the Evoca Quality Consortium, you were one of the first people that I spoke to ask your advice. And you were so supportive, not only willing to talk to me on the phone and give me ideas and your thoughts, but also participating in our conferences and sponsoring at a time when we were a small company and we needed support by influential people like you. And I'll always remember your support when we needed it, and what happened from there. Now it is the largest clinical trials consortium in the industry. So thank you for that. And thank you so much for spending some time with me on during this conversation. I really enjoyed it.
Thanks, Patty. I've enjoyed it as well. It's been great being associated with you through the last, what is it, 20 years? Gosh, it's quite a
It's
while.
a long time.
I'm glad we both look as though we're still 25 years old. I think that's great. But I have huge respect for people who set up organisations as you did with Evoca. That entrepreneurial spirit is something I have enormous time for. So I was very, very happy to play a small role in your success over that time. It's something that you have my great respect for.
Oh, well, that's so kind. Thank you so much.
Nice to talk to you.
Likewise.